Loibner-Waitkus.
Okay, let's discuss The Storm by Kate Chopin, which is a tough short story for me to start with for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a sexual nature, it's controversial nature, and number two, because I'm not used to being on video where anyone on the internet can watch these videos, so I have to be really careful what I say and how I word it. The other thing is, this is the first short story I've had to teach on video, so I had to kind of decide what to do. Normally, it would be about a 50-minute class that we would discuss this in, or possibly over the course of two 50-minute classes. And so you aren't going to sit there and watch me talk for an hour. So what I've had to decide to do, and I think I'm going to do with other short stories, is in a regular class setting, you would spend a good percentage of the time retelling the story, the plot, that kind of stuff. A lot of times because I was the only person in the room who'd read it, or the very few students had, and I needed to retell them, or they didn't understand that. So in these videos, I'm going to try to cut that out and hope that you picked up on major elements and that kind of stuff, and just give you my spin. Again, you can YouTube other people, you can search analyses. I may post some good ones on the website. So I want to hit on the stuff that I think is important. The first thing is, it's by Kate Chopin, whose most famous work is The Awakening. She was born in 1850 and lived till 1904. She wrote The Awakening in 1899, and it ultimately destroyed her career. She had been relatively successful with other works, short stories and things, enough to make a career out of it. And the sexual nature of The Awakening, which is nowhere near as controversial as The Storm, the publication destroyed her career. And in fact, she knew better, even though the Storm was written in 1898, so it was written again before she published The Awakening. She was smart enough to know not to publish it, that it would kill her career. And it was not published until after her death. They're conflicting, which I don't know why they're conflicting. We know that it was published in 1969, even though I've read other accounts saying it was published in 1972 for the first time. So again, we're looking at a good 60 years after she died. Another thing you need to know, and I always debate on how much to discuss this is a sequel. It is a sequel to a short story that she did publish called At the Acadian Ball, but this is a much more popular, much more commonly read short story in college classes and other areas. No one really reads At the Acadian Ball, so I kind of, as a professor, have to debate, how much of At the Acadian Ball do I need to discuss? And I'm going to go with not a lot. I think that this short story stands on its own. There is one major element, Calixta and Alcée and Bobino and the characters exist in that. The point is, Calixta cannot be with Alcée. She is Acadian or Cadian, what we would call Cajun. Alcée is Creole. Now, what is the difference there? Creole means, are French, again, both these are French descendants living in Louisiana. Creoles came up through the Caribbean, right, into the United States, stopping over maybe in some islands, but it was pretty direct. The Acadians, or Cajuns, more commonly known, came down they lived in Canada until were sort of pushed down because they didn't like how things were going there, came down and settled with the Creoles. The Creoles tended to be the landowners, the richer, the higher as far as socioeconomic level went, whereas the Cajuns were the lower level. And so Creoles and Cajuns couldn't mix very much in the way blacks and whites couldn't in the 40s, 50s. Again, Loving versus Virginia, 1969, the Supreme Court decision is what finally made it legal for African Americans and whites to marry in the United States. So before then, it could be against the law. Here, maybe not against the law, but certainly not socially acceptable at the time. Now, as far one little note I do want to make about plot is I want you to pay attention to the opening and the relationship between Bobino and his son Bibi. That's very important. I think later when we do Barn Burning by William Faulkner, we see a very similar situation as far as a son and a father in a country store, but we see a very different father and son. If the son is starving, the father's terrible. Bobino and Bibi have a good relationship, and we move from that into the domesticity of Calixta. She's putting up laundry. She's concerned about them, that kind of thing. And of course, then enters Alcée, whom we know she has a history with. The plot, I really want you to pay attention to the plot of this story. The plot follows, the storm sort of follows the plot line, right? And you know that plots, there's you start with the basic situation of the exposition. You have the narrative hook or the conflict. Things get more and more interesting. We hit the climax. Then we go down, falling action. And then we have the denouement, which is French, for conclusion. And you'll notice that the storm follows, the actual storm within the story follows the plot of that story, and specifically the sex that goes on. As the storm intensifies, Alcée gets closer to coming inside. As the storm intensified, once he's inside, they get closer to having sex. And then I'm going to reference Poltergeist for the second time so far this semester. And this is something that most of you probably learned as kids during storms. I know my father taught me this trick to count if there's lightning. To see how far away a storm is, you see the lightning, and you count how many seconds between lightning and thunder. So because light moves faster than sound. And so the sooner, the closer they are together, the closer the storm is. If they get closer together and then start being further apart as far as time is concerned, then the storm is going away. And then in Poltergeist, of course, the tree is struck right outside his window, the son's window, and so the storm is right over them. When the sex begins between Calixta and Alcée in the storm, the lightning strikes the chinaberry tree right outside their yard. So again, the storm could not be any more over them than it is at that very moment. So again, that is our climax of the story. That is the and again, we could get into sex and the word climax as well. So, and the climax of the story itself. So it's interesting that all of these things happen together. Now, the chinaberry tree is a very, very interesting symbol that's struck by lightning, and because one of the things that you have to ask is what role does religion play here? Because is Kate Chopin judging Calixta? But more so Calixta. Nobody really ever is like, is she judging Alcée? Because a man is expected to cheat in our culture. But we want to judge Calixta. And so what role does religion play here? Well, I think it's interesting because there are two references that you should pick up on. Or one you should pick up on, the other not so much, but I'm hoping you got. The Sunday clothes, she's hanging up church clothes, so we know they're churchgoers, and of course they would be Catholic. This is French, French descendants, so they're going to be Catholic. The chinaberry tree actually becomes a religious symbol because of rosary beads. It was a way, the berries from the chinaberry tree would actually be used to make rosaries in some cases. And so again, right when this lightning hits and they have sex, it's interesting that it strikes a chinaberry tree, which becomes very symbolic of religion, and specifically Catholicism here, as that goes. Now, what's in contradiction to this is this white. We see white as a symbol of purity, correct? And so throughout the story, there's all of this mention, the white sheets, the white of the interior of the house, her white flesh. And so that leaves a lot up to the reader. You need to decide, is what Kate Chopin saying, this act of sexuality, pure? Is this natural? Is it white? Is it clean? Is it, or is she doing this as an idea of contrast? Should we contrast what's actually going on with the purity and whiteness that it's surrounded by? Now, the ending, what makes the ending so interesting is we assume, and what makes this work so controversial, we've had affairs in works before that were published and accepted, but the woman or the cheaters are supposed to suffer, right? Something horrible is supposed to happen to them. How dare someone cheat and not die, or not get caught, or not get divorced, or not be a pariah? I mean, look at countless other stories that you read about adultery, and horrible things happen. And so it's interesting that it ends with the storm passes and everything's fine. And so it's Chopin's sort of way of saying a woman particularly, can have an affair and it not be the end of the relationship, the end of the world. She does not have to suffer for eternity because of this. So again, this makes it a very, very feminist story in a way. Or not in a way, it does make it a very feminist story. Now, one of the things I talk about a lot in class, and I think is really interesting, is a few years ago, Christopher Ryan and I'm going to pronounce this name wrong, Casilda Jetha, wrote a book together called Sex at Dawn. And what they decided that they would do is study monogamy throughout time. That's a big thing here, monogamy and infidelity, right? And the idea of this in a relationship. And we know, I did some research and pulled up a lot of statistics on infidelity in marriage. And they're vastly different from one study to another because, again, you have to get people to admit to cheating, which is tough to do. We used to say sort of 60% of men cheat in a marriage and 40% of women. We know in our most recent studies, the number of women have gone up, and it's believed to be, I think, about 58% men, 53% women. But, again, who knows who's telling the truth and who's not. The point is, if you're married, one of you is probably going to cheat. Now, I want to be really, really clear here. I'm a big fan of monogamy. Don't want to get too much into my personal life, but I've been in the same relationship for more than 17 years, have been married around 8, monogamous. I'm a big fan of it. So I don't want you to confuse any of this and say that I'm suggesting this. But Dan Savage, if you're familiar with Dan Savage, who started the It Gets Better campaign, he has a podcast called the Savage Love Cast and a column in The Stranger, which is a Seattle newspaper. He writes about sex, and he's become one of the biggest gay rights experts, one of the biggest human sexuality experts. And he said of Sex at Dawn, and I'm reading this quote, so I'm looking down, Sex at Dawn is the single most important book about human sexuality since Alfred Kinsey unleashed sexual behavior in the human male on the public in 1948. Now, what Sex at Dawn does is it looks at this and says, monogamy is not working. Why not? And his point is, the author's point in Sex at Dawn is we've not evolved away from that monogamy is not natural. We know that in tribal societies, and we have not evolved that much from tribal societies as far as, our needs, our brain, that kind of stuff. It was not fully understood how, and this is a pretty terrible summary, but I'm going to do my best, on where babies came from. And the idea was they kind of knew semen was involved, and they thought that it was an accumulation of semen. And if you're in a tribal time where people are dying left and right, diseases and that kind of thing, the idea was if a woman could, have as many men add up to this baby, that's the more father here. Think of Hillary Clinton's It Takes a Village, right? So if your baby has 8 fathers, then that's 8 people who will help you raise the child. And if that person has other babies with other people, that mother will get involved. Those mothers will help. And so again, this whole village sort of helps raise the child. What happened was we decided when we became an agrarian society, when we owned land, that women couldn't cheat. Okay, they were not allowed to cheat because we wanted our land to go to, we had figured out at this point where babies came from, right? One man, one woman. And men wanted to know that the land they were leaving to their offspring were actually their offspring. And so women weren't allowed to cheat. Men, it was relatively accepted until the civil rights movement. Really, seriously, as early as that, it was accepted that men could cheat as long as women didn't. And so what happened during the feminist movement was we had to just make a decision. Are men going to be forced to be monogamous, or are women going to be allowed to cheat like men can? And the authors of this book, I think, would make the argument that we made the wrong decision. We basically said neither one can cheat, and we can see from statistics that it's incredibly, incredibly unsuccessful. And so what I think is interesting about this story is in 1898, when she wrote it, I think Chopin saw this. I think that she knew that it was, for most people, not possible to be monogamous, and wanted to address that, women had that right to cheat just as much, and that cheating did not necessarily mean something horrible could happen. So I think it's a really, really great short story. Again, I know I focused on a couple of minutiae here rather than the bigger picture, but feel free to Google some analyses of these and give me your opinion and read through what the students in the classroom thought on the whole thing. Until next time.